All awake? Fantastic. Awake? Yeah? All right. A couple announcements here today. Just want to mention the skating is actually at 1 o'clock at the Mesa Arena. And I know, I believe it's misprinted. We failed to get changed on the calendar and the Google Calendar, so it got printed as 3 o'clock in the bulletin, but it's actually 1 o'clock in the Mesa Arena. Okay, so even if you don't want to skate, if you just want to come out, have a hot chocolate, and be together, 1 o'clock at the Mesa Arena for skating. Also, want to mention to you coming up, excuse me, in January. If we get enough to sign up for it, we will make it a go. There's a sheet over there for a marriage enrichment workshop weekend. It's actually just a Friday and Saturday. And so the dates, do you guys know the dates? 20th and 21st. So the idea is this, you will come here to the church on a Friday night, you and your spouse. You'll sign up for the assessment, which is $35. We will get you signed up for the assessment, then we kick you out. We kick you out of the church. We want you to go out to eat. You go out to eat, and then later that night, we want you to read an article, and there'll be actually 2 articles that you will read, and then you will do an assessment. Then Saturday morning, you come back to the church at 9 o'clock in the morning. We'll have all the assessments graded and prepared. And then we'll go from 9 o'clock to noon, we'll go over the assessment as a large group. Now, we won't be comparing answers, like what did you get for this answer? But we'll be going through some role-playing, we'll talk about it, and then...
for just married people.
Yeah. But if you want to come and attend, and you sit in a group, right? So that'll be on Friday night. It starts, I believe, 5:30. Check the bulletin, it's in there, but it'll be Friday night, and then it'll go on Saturday till noon, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? So you'll come here to the church, register, then we kick you out, and you go out to eat. You can go out with couples if you want, by yourself, just you and your spouse, and then come back Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, and we'll go through the assessment together. We'll put you on tables with your spouse, and then we'll go through it together, okay? Make sense? All right, anything else to add here as far as we have mentioned for announcements? Okay, let's pray and I'll tell you what we're doing today, okay? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your gift of grace and mercy for us. We thank you for the gift of truth. May we be steadfast in your truth always. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, in the 1970s, there was a great battle, and the battle was the battle for the Bible. Now, if you can recall, the Seminex went through in the 1970s. I just talked to Pastor Roth, and so it was right around the time he graduated from Springfield, and it was going on in the St. Louis Seminary, and it was a battle over the Bible. Can we trust the Bible itself? And so the great battle of the 1960s and 70s and 80s was over the inerrancy of the Scriptures. Can we trust the Bible? Or do we approach the Bible and critique it and have man's interpretation over top of it? So when I talk to the confirmation students about do we read the Bible or does the Bible read us, this is displaying that the Bible reads us. We do not impose our intellect over top of it. So the 1970s was the great battle of the Bible. And that generation, that church generation, their fight was for the inerrancy of Scripture. Right now, we have a battle that's going on, and we are starting to see it appear here in the Minot community. And so far, to my understanding, many churches in the Missouri Synod have actually stood against it. We've seen it encroaching into some of our universities, our Concordia universities. It was encroaching, what we're going to talk about was encroaching, it has been encroaching into Concordia Mequon. We had a professor there that sounded the alarm, Professor Gregory Schultz. He's a close friend of mine. We've used some of his material here in the church before. He sounded the alarm on that university. And so the battle for this generation is on what we call logocentric ideology, logocentric theology. Now, that may make no sense to you, but by the time we're done, it'll make perfect sense to you. So what we're going to be covering right now is this generation's battle. So just as important as the 1970s on Seminex, this subject is right now is the battle for the next 10 to 20 or 30 years for this generation of this church. That make sense? Okay. So we're going to go through this a little bit speedily, and if you have questions, please raise your hand. We'll try to answer them the best we can here. So what we want to do is we want to focus on what we are fighting over and what the thrust is, and that is what? Logocentric ideology. Okay, so what on earth, you may say, what on earth does this logocentric ideology, what does that mean? What does it mean itself? To understand this, we want to go back to the Greek philosophers, and we want to go back approximately 2,500 years, okay? If we look back 2,500 years, there's a guy named Heraclitus, and Heraclitus was about 500 BC, and he said this. He said, "Do not listen to me, but listen to the Logos," or Logos or Logos. Technically in the Greek it would be Logos, but we can say Logos too, okay? So don't listen to me, but listen to Logos. And he said this, "All things come into being according to this Logos," okay? So according to Heraclitus, everything that exists is here because of what he called the Logos. This is his term that he coined in the Greek, and that word is Logos, okay? He goes on to say, according to Heraclitus, everything was changing from day to day, okay? And from moment to moment. His famous illustration is this, that it was impossible to step twice into the same river, okay? The river's always flowing, and you cannot step into the same river because when you step into it again a second time, the water's already changed. And so he said this, but even though it's impossible to step in the same river twice into the same river, but if that be so, why was life not completely chaos if it was always changing? So he looked at the world, and the world was always changing. You had seasons, you had life, you had death, you had different fluctuation. Life was always changing. But then he came up with this question, if everything's changing, why does it not all spin out of control? And so for Heraclitus, let's get this clicker to work. Boy, this is not working like I had it set up. Okay. So for Heraclitus, the Logos is the real feature of the cosmos that stays the same. So in other words, there's something at the center of everything, and that is the Logos. According to Heraclitus, the world is full of change, but it is not in chaos. It is structured by a world order that is divine in nature. Now keep in mind, he's a Greek philosopher. He's not a Hebrew scholar. He's not a Christian scholar. He is a pagan Greek scholar. And he said the Logos kept things in control. It set the pattern. We talked about this with the youth the other day at the youth lock-in, and we said that basically if you have a band of people, right, trumpets and drummers and flutes and clarinets, you come in and they're all playing according to the same tempo, the same notes, and so forth. You would say there's something that's holding them together. What was holding them together? The conductor. The conductor is the one feature of that band that keeps all the diversity of instruments, all the diversity of notes, keeps them in unison. It's the actual conductor of the band. And so the band itself, without a conductor, it's complete chaos, but because you have all these different moving parts, they work together, it's because of the conductor. And so that's how we use that illustration to talk about the Logos. The Logos is that which keeps order in life. So Heraclitus, he believed that there's one Logos uniting the many changing things of the world into a one world order, and it's the common feature. Although things may deviate and change in life, right? Seasons, life, death, cold, hot, up, down, left, right. Even though things would change, he said that there's the one feature that kept it all together, and he called it again the Logos. And he attributed divine qualities to the Logos. He said it was something supernatural, something powerful above mankind. Okay? So he also went on to say that the wise people are those who listen not to the changing of the world, but they listen to the Logos. They honor the Logos. And he said the fools were those who disregard the Logos and deviate from it. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay? So, even though he was a Greek scholar, pagan at best, okay? Even though he was pagan at best, move this over here. even though he was pagan at best, he did have this understanding which we would agree with this to this point. So the question is, who did not agree with this? There were individuals who did not like Heraclitus of what he taught. And this is kind of a cool term. They're called the sophists. You guys say sophists? Sophists, okay? There were sophists. There's one guy named Protagoras, okay? He's about 450 BC. Protagoras, and get this. You may say, okay, what on earth does this have to do with 2023? It has everything to do with 2023. History repeats itself. Protagoras, he said, of all things, the measure is mankind. Of existing things that they exist, of non-existing things that they do not exist. Who is the measure of all things? The Logos? No, Protagoras said who? Mankind. Mankind is the measure of all things. Remember Heraclitus? He said, don't listen to me, listen to the Logos. Protagoras says, listen to who? Listen to mankind. Listen to mankind. Okay? All right? So, let's talk about these sophists a little bit more. So the sophists, they were against the Logos. For Protagoras, the individual being, rather than the Logos, is the ultimate source of value. Personal experience, judgment, and interpretation rule. So who is the master and commander of defining what reality is, the Logos or mankind? Mankind. Okay? Mankind. So this brings up an interesting problem. Okay? How is one to discern truth from mere opinion? The sophist's answer is that one cannot. All that we can have and all that we can ever have are opinions. For human beings, things are as they seem to be. No more can be said. So the idea was back in that day you would have these city-states, right? These cities that were like governing states. And Heraclitus would actually say that there's one general rule that would rule all the city-states. Protagoras said, no, each city-state is a rule unto themselves. So whatever is right for this city may not be right for this one, but this one might be right, so they both can be right at the same time. And what would happen is what Heraclitus would say, no, there's an objective standard, and Protagoras is like, no, there doesn't need to be, because mankind is the measure of all things. Okay, so how can one discern from truth from your opinion? The Protagoras and the sophists said you cannot. Okay, so we look at these two. How are they different? How are they different? Let's see how they're different. So Heraclitus, okay, what did Heraclitus do? He pointed to himself. No, he pointed towards the Logos. He said, do not listen to me, listen to the Logos. Listen to that central feature of the cosmos, that one thing that keeps all things together. Listen to the Logos. Listen to truth. What did Protagoras do? Protagoras did this. He said what? Do not listen to the Logos, but instead listen to who? Listen to mankind. And where is truth? Truth is found in mankind. Does this sound familiar? Sounds very, very familiar. Okay? So here's the problems with the sophists. Okay? By questioning the absolute foundation of traditional institution, beliefs, and the way of life, sophists, they tended to foster a relativistic attitude, though the evil latents of sophism lay not so much in the fact that it raised problems as in the fact that it could not offer any satisfactory intellectual solution to the problems that it raised. In other words, the problem with the sophists is that they pointed back to mankind and they created all sorts of inconsistencies, but they didn't really have any solution to that. It's just that mankind, individual mankind, was the source and the rule for all things. Okay? So it created all sorts of problems. Okay? All sorts of problems. So what happened was there was an ancient fight. Okay? There was an ancient fight that existed some 2,500 years ago. And that ancient fight was against, we would call the sophists. And then you see guys such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And even though they were Greeks and they were pagans, they were not inconsistent with what? Christian faith. Even though that was the case, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they were fighting against who? The sophists. They believed in an objective logos, an objective standard. They believed that if society went the way of the sophists, that it would unravel society and destroy culture. They were fighting against what? The sophists. Now, you would say to yourself, what's happening today? The same battle is happening right now in our culture, in Western civilization. It's a battle that already happened 2,500 years ago, and it's happening yet again. Happening yet again. So what happened in this ancient fight? The Socrates, so you guys have heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? Yeah. Right? Okay, you've heard of them before. The reason why you've not heard of Protagoras, the reason why you haven't heard of him a whole lot, is what happened. In this ancient fight, the sophists lost. Who won? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They won. Okay? So the sophists lost. Okay? So, when we look at Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, from the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, men who fought against the sophists, Western civilization has been categorized as having logocentrism. Well, I can't even say that word. Logocentrism. Maybe I can say that. Help me out. So, logocentric view. For example, the Greeks were logocentric due to the work of these three philosophers. They understood that there was a hub at the center. There was a conductor, somebody that held all things together. And again, that was the logos. That's the feature of the cosmos. And again, they didn't really define the logos a whole lot. They just knew it was a divine nature, potentially would be goddish, but it was a feature that kept things together. Okay? You guys tracking with me so far? Okay? So far, so good? Okay. So what do? They beat back Protagoras and the sophists. But did they beat them back for good? Okay? So why should we really care about this? Because history repeats itself. History absolutely repeats itself. Okay? So I'm going to introduce you to a guy that I'm not a fan of. Okay? I'm not a fan of him at all. I really have negative feelings. Jacques Derrida is his name. He's a French philosopher. Okay? So Jacques Derrida is most noted for, and he's a very, very influential philosopher, even though he's passed away for about now coming up on 20 years, his ideology has been at work in culture for quite some time. Jacques Derrida is most noted for his work of the field of what we call deconstructionism. To deconstruct. What does it mean to deconstruct? Tear apart, to tear down, right? So if you can construct something, you build something. If you deconstruct, you tear it down. So Jacques Derrida, he was in the field of deconstructionism. It's a field of study that questions traditional assumptions about certainty, identity, and truth. Its aim, now here's the aim of this. Now this is from a secular philosophy book. This is not a Christian book. But the secular philosopher book says that his aim of Jacques Derrida is to dislodge Western civilization from a logocentric view. He is fighting against logocentric view. So we could say he's exactly like who? The ancient who? The ancient sophists. Yep. The ancient sophists. Okay? So the point is, the deconstructionists that we have in our culture right now, they're not new. They're the old sophists, or perhaps we could call them neo-sophists or new sophists. So what we see in culture right now, the war on words, the war on what we would call traditional values, when we are tearing down these categories of male and female, gender, when we're tearing down the institution of marriage, we're tearing all these things down. It's the work of the deconstructionists, and their ultimate aim is to dislodge the logocentric view of culture that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle fought to preserve. So this war that we have right now in 2023 is the same war that was fought 2,500 years ago, where Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, where they won, and right now we're in the same war, and the victory of who comes out on top is still to be seen and heard what happens. Okay, that makes sense? All right. Okay. So, look at some of these phrases here. Does this sound like Protagoras? It's true for me, but not true for you, but not true for me. Your truth and my truth may not be the same. My voice, my truth, always be true to yourself. Where does that locate the idea of truth? In the Logos or in yourself? In yourself, right? In yourself. And so in our society, we are seeing more and more and more people locating truth where? Right here with themselves. Okay? Right here with themselves. I'm going to pause there. Any questions so far? Are you guys tracking with me? A lot of philosophy, but it is extremely relevant. Okay? So the question is, what happens and why should we care about this? What happens and why should we care about this? Well, we should really care about this because when truth is located with ourselves, what it produces is something called nihilism or nihilism. Nihilism or nihilism, I've heard it pronounced both different ways. The word nihilism or nihilism is a philosophical term. The nihilism is from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. Now, believe it or not, we've studied this before when we studied Ecclesiastes. When Solomon looks at everything and he says, what? It's vanity. It's empty. That's what he's appealing to nihilism. Okay? So the philosophy of nihilism teaches that traditional morals, ideas, and beliefs have no worth or value. It teaches that we cannot resolve and answer the most basic questions of life, for there is no such thing as an objective ground of truth. Life does not have an objective meaning, for it does not have a final destiny. So if there's no objectiveness, no final destiny, man is the measure of all things, then guess what? Nothing else matters. There's an old band called Linkin Park, and they sang a song back in the 90s. It says, in the end, nothing really matters. That's what? Nihilism. That's nihilism to a T. There's a famous author named David Foster Wallace. He is a true nihilist. And he came to the point and realized if there's no meaning to life, then all that I have to look forward to the rest of my life is what? Suffering and ultimately death. And if there's no meaning, no objective standard, then I just die and I cease to exist. So he's like, why don't I just kill myself now? It's just be easier, less suffering. And so he committed suicide. That is the fruit of nihilism. Okay? So nihilism excludes the possibility of God, an objective truth. It rejects the Logos. Okay? It makes man the center of the universe. And so as a result of it, mankind essentially takes the place of God, meaning that mankind must be the source of all creativity, all knowledge, all wisdom, all meaning, all ethics, and so forth. This is the reason why we have so many individuals in our society that are trying to find their place in this world. Because if there's no Logos, and if they are the subjective realm of truth, then they have to figure out who they are, why they exist, where they're going, and the meaning of life. That's a lot of pressure to put where? Right here on yourself. Okay? Okay? A lot of pressure. So here's what's happening with nihilism. Christianity has God here, mankind underneath, and so we see God as the what? The Logos. But nihilism rejects, okay, so we see God above us. Nihilism actually rejects God, and as a result of rejecting God, okay, mankind, and you have this. So nihilism basically has what? The man as the measure of all things. Remember Protagoras? Man is the measure of all things, what is to be and what is not to be. It's the measure of man. So if man is the measure of all things, what ends up happening is this. Depression. One can see the depressive mood of the American spirit, a spirit that has been plagued with the burdens of trying to be God. I would argue that we so much desire, like Adam and Eve, we desire to be like God, right? but we cannot function like God. We cannot bear the weight of being a God unto ourselves. It is exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting to try to be the ruler and the master commander of your own universe. But to what? To be a slave to Christ? That's a wonderful thing. The burden's off. Okay? All right. So what does this have to do with Christianity? Okay? Why are we studying this here? What does this have to do with Christianity? If we look at John 1, okay, if we look at John 1, I'm going to read this in the original language, and I want you to listen to the original language. Okay, I'm going to read it in the English first. It says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, we've heard that before, right? Okay, here's the Greek. So listen to the Greek, see if you can hear it. In arche, in ha logos, kai ha logos, in prostan theon, kai theos in ha logos. What did you just hear there? Logos, yeah. So the word that we have for the word logos, we translate as the Word. So here's what John is saying. In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, if you are Heraclitus, remember Heraclitus? He says, don't look to me, look to the Logos. If Heraclitus was alive when John wrote this, and Heraclitus opened it up, he would say this: in the beginning was the Logos. Heraclitus would say, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I agree with that. And the Logos was with God. Heraclitus would say, yeah, I'm good with that. And the Logos was God. He'd say, I'm kind of okay with that. I would say there's divineness to the Logos. Then you get to verse 14. Check this out. Kai ha Logos sarke agenita kai es ke nosin. And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Now what would Heraclitus say? What? The Logos put on human flesh and lived among us? You know what Heraclitus would say? Wow, where is that? Where's the Logos? Where is that one who put on flesh? I want to meet him. I want to listen to him. I want to see him. And then you can imagine John saying, oh, he's in Bethlehem, laying in a manger. Heraclitus would say, the one who holds the whole world together, the one who is the main feature of the cosmos that holds all things together, is a baby lying in a manger? John would say, yeah. And he goes in the manger, and then guess what? That babe goes to a cross, dies, and resurrects. Right? Right? Wow. Okay? So Greek, yep, so there's Logos right there. Greek thought knew all about the Logos. It saw in the Logos the creating and guiding direction of power of God, the power which made the universe and kept it going. So John came to the Greeks and said, now keep in mind, John wrote in his Gospel of John, he wrote to the Greeks. Matthew wrote his Gospel to the Jews. Okay? So John has a lot of Greek ideology that he is actually pushing in his Gospel of John. So John came to the Greeks and he said this: hey, for centuries you've been thinking and writing and dreaming about the Logos, the power which made the world, the power which keeps the order of the world, and the power by which men think and reason and know, the power by which men come into contact with God. Jesus is that Logos. He's come down to earth. Right? Boom. Isn't that cool? So the Logos is divine, and the Greeks would say, yeah. But John is saying, hey, the Logos is flesh and blood, Jesus Christ. Okay? We also hear about Jesus. Look at this, what Paul says. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created. By who? Jesus. In heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers, authorities, all things were created through Jesus and for Jesus. And Jesus is before all things, and in Jesus all things hold together. And Jesus is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything Jesus might be preeminent. For in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Okay? What are we seeing that the New Testament is stating? The center of the cosmos, the center of the world, the center of all things is Jesus, who put on flesh. Okay? Who put on flesh. Okay? So, as we see here, who is Logos? Okay? Let me go back here. Who is the Logos? Okay? Where is truth? We'd say who? Jesus. Okay? So the current fight, apologize for the dates, we'll say 2023. The current fight right now is the deconstructionists are trying to convert truth to where? To mankind. We are holding the Logos, and that truth is where? And the Logos is who? It's Christ. Okay? Is Christ himself. Okay? So, I've left us enough time. We got about 15 minutes to make sure we all understand that and talk a little bit about the implications of that. So, who did I lose? Did everybody track with me there? Okay? How do we summarize what we just stated then? How do we summarize? What's the center of all things? Christ. Yep, we could say the Logos, which is Christ. Okay? And so when the deconstructionists are trying to dislodge the Logos, even if our Western civilization doesn't recognize Christ as the Logos, by them kicking out the Logos, they're actually attacking who? Christ himself as well. Okay? Now, the deconstructionists, do they understand that the church understands the Logos as Christ? Yes, they do. And they would see the church as an institution that's promoting the Logos. Okay? And I would say that in our culture right now, the fight is going to be, over the next 20 years, is whether or not we have a logocentric worldview, that there is a Logos at the center. Okay? Now, even the pagans of our culture, there are pagans out in our culture that are fighting for a logocentric worldview. They do not recognize the Logos as Christ, but nonetheless, they recognize that there is a thing at the center and that mankind is not what? The center. Okay? Let me ask you, what happens if mankind becomes the center of all things? Trouble. Okay, so just imagine this. Let's talk about words. If words are not logocentric, and words are what I make them to be, if I want to use a word and make it up to be what I want it to be, and I construct words and use words according to what I think they should mean, and let's just say Pastor Roth back there, he decides to do with words what he wants, and Ray decides to do what he wants with the words, and that he gets defined, we all get to define our own words, can we communicate? No. It's the breakdown of communication in our society. Okay? Words are logocentric. Keep in mind, who named things in the very beginning in Genesis 1? Adam named things. God has a word, and his words define things. His words define reality. And so when we take words and we reinvent words and redo the words the way that we want according to our own understandings, we start breaking down a logocentric view of language itself. Okay? This is one of the attacks on words. In our society, we are having an attack on the word marriage. Back when same-sex marriage was actually legalized, what people don't understand is that I do not agree in same-sex marriage at all. I don't agree with that. What I was more offended by than same-sex marriage being legalized was that our Supreme Court redefined the word marriage. They changed the definition of marriage. One of my concerns right now with this idea of gender, sex and gender, which is the reason why I took out the article, letter to the editor in the article of the Minot Daily, was that individuals in Minot were redefining the word gender, what it meant. And we see the sophist ideology at work right here in Minot itself, in other churches too, as well. Okay? That makes sense? So if we lose a logocentric worldview, we lose the objectiveness of Christ. If we do not have Christ, then man is the measure of all things. Can you imagine coming to this church and that you are the measure of all things and I'm the measure of all things? What would happen? Okay, so imagine this, okay? Let's just imagine that man is the measure of all things. That means every single person in this building, in this room, we have about what? 65 people in here? Let's just say we go the way of Protagoras, and you are the measure of all things. And that truth is up to what you decided to be. How many truths do we have in this room? 65. Now, here's what happens. If you have 65 different truths in this room, whose truth wins? The strongest one, who is either what? The loudest, the most of a bully, or what? The one who can inflict the most harm. So if you have 65 truths in this room, the truth that would actually win is the person who can wield the most power and influence and beat down the rest of the people as much as he can or she can, and that truth will prevail. And then if another truth comes out that is opposing, then you do what to that truth? You cancel them, you silence them, you punish them so that they do not challenge the prevailing truth. If you have a logocentric view of truth, which I would say that our confessions do that for us, the confessions say that truth is what? Held in the scriptures itself, according to what? As we interpret them according to the Lutheran confessions. Our truth, our standard of truth, is not located in Pastor Roth or myself or even you. The idea of truth is located in the Holy Writ, governed by what? Our interpretation, which is going to be the Lutheran confessions. The creeds, okay? And so we could say for the truth, as a church, you do not look to Pastor Richard, you do not look to what? Roth, you look to the Logos, Jesus. You look to his Holy Writ. Yep.
Sounds to me like democracy is very close to becoming, well, we're talking about democracy and everybody should have a voice, but it can be very close to turning to a dictatorship, again, the one person that takes the power.
Yeah.
If democracy is not based on God.
Yeah.
You lose that God basis, and we can make the turn to the dark side very quickly.
Well, I would say, okay, so like if we take a faulty view of democracy, we're going to speak in the realm of politics. We take a faulty view of democracy. A faulty view of the democracy is that we take the vote of the opinion and the strongest voice wins. I would say that's not a true democracy. A true democracy is going to be ruled by what? What is the logos of democracy? It's going to be the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So just as we have Holy Writ, right? A holy scripture, okay, that governs us. I like how Gregory Schultz talks about it. He says that in the right-hand kingdom, the church, we have the Holy Writ that governs us. In the left-hand kingdom, they have a Holy Writ per se, and that's going to be the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Okay, that's going to be the governance. So democracy is not the rule of the many. It's rule of the many governed by something that's objective and bigger than the rule of the many, which is a constitution. So if you want to have mankind rule and you have the loudest voice, and let's just say the Holy Bible or the Constitution stands in your way, what must you do to those? To silence it, to remove it. That makes sense? Okay? So my conviction, to be very, very blunt with you, my conviction as a pastor, the next 20 years, so I'm 43, okay, in the next 20, 25 years, my conviction for St. Paul's Lutheran Church is that we know the scriptures and we know the Lutheran confessions the best that we can to weather the storm in the next 20 to 25 years. So that we know the scriptures, we know the confessions, we know what truth is, that we're aware of what's going on in our culture and the influence of the culture. That make sense? Questions, thoughts? Roth.
Comment about the late 90s. Another pastor and I went out to a conference, I guess you'd call it. It was a kind of non-denominational or interdenominational conference in Williston. There was an individual who had come back from Asia as a missionary. He'd been gone for 25 years. He made the statement, when I left, it was just beginning to be argued, is there absolute truth? And I came back and I was shocked to find that the argument was over with. Everybody assumed there is no absolute truth. And that was 25 years ago or so. And I think that's part of our problem, or our situation, that what's true for me is not what's true for you. That's what you get when you don't have absolute truth. And if you look at the Bible as absolute truth, we have a solid foundation. If it's, like you said, whatever we believe, whatever right for me, you got a mess.
Yeah.
That's what we're getting to.
You guys remember that sermon a couple of weeks ago? I was talking about the church and what governs the church, which is Christ, and I had a little phrase in there, and was referring to, I said, God doesn't care about your feelings. And I said that in the way, now there's a context, keep in mind. God doesn't understand our feelings, but the feelings, in other words, our opinions about what reality is. I was attacking what? The sophist. When I used that line, I was attacking sophism. That sermon went online and went a little viral and stirred up a bunch of individuals, and I got a bunch of emails on it, and I just ignored all of them. But it was going against what? Attacking that individualism of the individual, governing and making our own little worlds. I would say that it's of utmost importance that we are captive to the Word of God and that we're slaves to Christ. This idea of us being free, freedom is a horrifying idea, spiritually speaking. I do not want to be free as a Christian. I want to be a bondservant of Jesus. I want to be a slave to Christ, because that's true freedom, is to be a slave to Jesus. That's true freedom. But to be totally free, to do whatever I want, what would happen? To be the ruler of all things? If I was able to do that, if Matt Richard could be totally free to do whatever Matt Richard wants, what would Matt Richard do? He'd destroy himself and everybody else in that path. We want to be slaves to Christ. What does Paul say? He says, I'm a bondservant. He takes a negative connotation of bondservant, a slave, and he puts a positive spin. We're to be bondservants and captive to the Word of God, bondservants of Jesus, because we have a logocentric view, which is Christ. That makes sense? Okay? Yes, Roth?
I would make an observation that with the Respect for Marriage Act, that I haven't read it or anything, but I call it the Disrespect for Christian Marriage Act. What's scary to me is that if we are now, as a congregation, no longer able to speak up against the views of the world, in other words, preach the law, then we cannot preach the gospel, because the gospel has no effect without the law, without realizing that we're sinful. And if we're coming to the point where we're not able to proclaim the law, we're probably pretty much shot in the foot. And that's kind of where we're going in our country.
There's going to be a point in time, I'm going to say in the next couple of years, I would be willing to bet, there'll be a point in time, and I'm surprised we're not there yet. There'll be a point in time where right now, Pastor Roth and I, when we do weddings before what? The blessing before the church, and we do it on behalf of what? The state. So we have a dual status when we do a wedding here at St. Paul's, when Pastor Roth and I do a wedding. We're on the one hand giving the blessing of the church, and we're also performing that marriage vow in respect on behalf of the state. In my humble opinion, there's going to be a time and place, and I'm surprised we're not there yet, there'll be a time and a place where, as pastors, we will no longer be able to what? Do it on behalf of the state. And I think there'll be a time and a place coming up in the next probably 10 years where we'll have to tell people, you got to go down to the state and get married, buy the Justice of the Peace, get registered, and just do all that. And then you come here just exclusively just for what? The blessing. Because what will end up happening is if we do not do that on behalf of the state for a same-sex couple, they'll put the screws to us and so forth, and then we will what? Be sued and all that kind of stuff. So there will be a time and place where we may just end up saying like this, go down to the Justice of the Peace, take care of it, and we'll just do a blessing here. So we'll see what happens. Okay?
That's already in Asia already.
Yep,
They are doing it. They've been doing it for years.
Yep. I get phone calls. We get phone calls at the church all the time. Will you do our wedding? My answer is always yes. I'm always yes. However, I tell them, I say, you have to become a member of St. Paul's Lutheran Church. We don't do members for non-members. Well, what does that take? Well, there's approximately 26 videos and then classes with me. And then when you're done with that, you have 10 hours of premarital counseling with me. And so nobody's ever pushed that envelope, you know.
They had to get married 3 times, once for the country that they were in, once for the church, and once for the U.S.
Huh. Fascinating.
I'm gonna just make an observation that, well, I mean, this kind of thing has been going on for at least 125 years. There was a time in the late 1800s where mankind thought that we were the measure of all things, that we decided what's going to happen in our life, etc. We invented wonderful things like the steam engine and telegraph and ultimately radio and airplanes and so wow, we're really something. Then came World War II. World War I, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And mankind began to realize what mankind can do to mankind.
Yeah.
And suddenly we realized maybe we're not as hot as we think we are. And then, of course, things got a little more raucous during the 20s, then came the 30s, the Depression, and people kind of came back to God, as somebody said, where else could you go for a nickel? And then, came World War II, and then things got relaxed. The 70s got nuts and whatever, and it's gotten nutser ever since. But I suspect maybe there'll be a time when God will rein us in again. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a very, very good point. Yeah.
On experience, none of us do, but maybe it's a necessity.
The 1800s, late 1800s, absolutely. Pastor Roth is 100% right. The late 1800s was a time of prosperity, movement. There's a lot of confidence in the ability of mankind. In World War I, World War II, it devastated that. It brought a humility back. It's a very, very, very good point. Do you have a comment? No?
It's interesting how last week the science of things and this week with the philosophy of things are all in the mysteries of trying to understand the ultimate wisdom of God and how from the beginning it was there. So
Yep.
they're trying to come up with new knowledge or get the wisdom that was there in the beginning when Christ was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the really scary part for society right now is AI, artificial intelligence, and how that's gonna. There's a lot of people, like you said, that in this country, in the world, that don't know the logos, and so they're lost and trying to find themselves in the darkness. And AI is going to provide, I think, a way out for people. And the scary part is that will be the logos for mankind. That's coming quick.
Yeah. I've noticed a lot of comments, a lot of reading I've done. I've noticed there's a nihilistic despair among many, especially younger men, who they just. I've heard younger men say, I just want somebody to tell me what I'm supposed to do. What am I supposed? There's a clamor. It's like I don't want all that pressure just on me to be. I can't handle that. One of the reasons, and be very blunt on this, one of the reasons why I came to the Missouri Synod is I saw this fight happening and beginning to brew about 9 years ago, actually 10 years ago. I wanted to be in a synod that had the creeds every Sunday and had the historical liturgy. Because I realized that the historical liturgy goes back, centuries. It's bigger than Matt Richard, and the creeds are bigger than Matt Richard, and our lectionary is bigger than Matt Richard, and that I can just hide myself in, and I know my place as a pastor. Okay? Very cool. It's very cool for us as a church. Go ahead, Wade.
You take a look, God has seen all this, obviously. But he uses the terminology, the word is God, and the word is God.
Yeah.
So it all comes back to that very first statement.
Yep.
The word
Yep.
and Christ
Yep.
is truth is God.
Period. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good stuff, huh, guys? Interesting. Okay. So what do we do as a church? We do what we have been doing, in the last 125 years. Christ and Him crucified. Stay consistent, steadfast. And I would say that we do it boldly. and confidently, right? As we move forward. Okay, let's stand and pray. I thank you, my Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you would keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all of my doings in life may please you. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen. All right. Thank you, everyone.
When I went to fill out